Now, the good stuff. Do we have to give everything to the bishop's storehouse to be living the law of consecration? Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the program. Let's talk about the law of consecration. Do we fully understand it as Latter-day Saints? Have we added more to the Doctrine and Covenants and the revelations about the law of consecration? Does the law of tithing replace the law of consecration? Or are we in fact already living the law of consecration? Was the law of tithing a more complete understanding of what we were supposed to do, to give? Was it a biblical principle that we didn't fully grasp until further revelation was given to the prophet Joseph Smith? And are we not still living the law of consecration? We vow to live it in the house of the Lord today. So let's talk about that. We're going to talk about this, and that it's a misunderstood law, a very misunderstood law, at least according to Stephen Harper, who I listen to, and I'll leave the link, byu.edu podcasts, and I played it on high speed so I could do my own little academic review outline. This is a summary, and it was interesting. At first, I'm like, what? We don't live the higher law yet. We're not living the United Order yet. He makes a very interesting case, a good case, that we didn't quite understand what was going on for the saints, what the law of consecration meant for the majority of the saints. Okay, so let's go through this. The law. So I made an outline, and then you guys can listen to the podcast on your own. I'll leave the link. Here we go. The law of consecration, and forgive my misspelling because I was going pretty fast at this. It's been a long day. Andrea and I are really busy. The law of consecration, a very misunderstood law. Why tithing did not replace the law of consecration. Now remember, this is my these are my notes and observations. Doesn't mean I won't explore further the law of consecration. This is what this Professor Stephen Harper, he is a professor of church history and doctrine, has researched and written extensively on the law of consecration, has recently published a fabulous new book in the Let's Talk About series. And I'm actually reading, I'm going to give you guys a little preview here. I'm going to have Professor Givens, Terrell, why is it so blurry right there? Come on. Terrell Givens, he also wrote a book on the Let's Talk About series called Faith and Intellect. And I'm going to really have to keep up with him because he is, intellect is an understatement. He's a very intellectual man, and I think misunderstood by a lot of traditionalists. He loves the gospel of Jesus Christ, in spite of what some might think. And he's very eloquent in his words. We're going to have him on in the middle of March. I have an appointment with him to have a Zoom meeting on the 14th of March. And I made a joke to Andrea because I went and watched with the Elders Quorum, and I took my two boys. We did an Elders Quorum activity, and we watched Ant-Man. And at the beginning, or they go to this planet and they can't understand the aliens. Not planet, I'm sorry. They go to like an inner space thing, right? And they can't understand the aliens, and they have to drink this serum, and then all of a sudden they're hearing everything in English, right? It's like going to the Star Wars bar. Kind of reminded me of some elements of it were like Star Wars. And then all of a sudden you can understand, if you drink this serum, everyone can understand each other's language. And I said, I'm going to have to drink this serum Brother Givens and I are going to have to drink it so that I can, he can come down to my level and I can go up to his as far as intellect, the vernacular is concerned, and understand what he's saying. But I think with the help of the Lord and through prayer, I can understand what he's saying. Okay, so let's talk about this. This is according to Stephen Harper. Why tithing did not replace the law of consecration. A baseline and pre-class, quiz with over 700 BYU students in a Doctrine and Covenants class just to check their understanding. So he did a study. They did a study with 700 BYU students. One of the questions dealt with their understanding of the law of consecration. This is how it read. The law of consecration, A, is not practiced by the church today. B, is not practiced in the church today, but will be brought back in the millennium. C, is practiced in part in the church today through tithes. That's not supposed to be tithes. This is speech to text. And offerings, but not in full. Or D, is practiced in full in the church today. Which option do you think the students selected most? Well, half of the students selected option C, that said that consecration is only partly practiced in the church through tithes and offerings, but not in full, as though tithing is somehow a lesser law of Moses, interim, and we're waiting for future full consecration to come about. As further evidence of this, 31% of the students selected option B. That said, consecration was not practiced at all in the church today, but will be brought back one day in the millennium. Only 17% of my BYU students chose option D, that consecration is practiced in full in the church today. And I believe that was Stephen Harper that did that study. Tithing is not a lesser law than consecration. This is folklore doctrine. I'm actually reading, I told you about that already, that I'm reading Terrell Given's book, Let's Talk About, in the Let's Talk About series, Faith and Reason, and we'll be having him on the program in mid-March. Stephen C. Harper states this, so it makes it difficult to live up to our privileges and blessings, covenants, and obligations if we don't really know what they're about. Speaking of the law of consecration, some scholars have called this articulation a folk doctrine, meaning it kind of came from the saints rather than from God. It gets in the way of revealed doctrine, having that preconceived idea. One way to give background on this, to say, so some of what I copied and pasted was, so I cut and pasted a lot, and it's actually quoting him. So you have the podcast, and then over to the right, the text, the speech to text is going, and so you keep up with that as well. You can read along with it, and I believe that's for the hearing impaired. But so some of what you read here is him actually speaking. So he says, so it makes it difficult to live up to our privilege and blessings, covenants, and obligations if we don't really know what they're talking about. Some scholars have called this articulation a folk doctrine, meaning it kind of came from the saints rather than from God. It gets in the way of revealed doctrine. One way to give background on this is to say, well, in February 1831, the Lord revealed it. But man has always owed everything to God from the beginning. That's so true. This doctrine is in all of the standard works. It's in the book of Moses. It's in the book of Abraham. Speaking of the law of consecration, it's in the Old Testament, as you know. It's in the New Testament. King Benjamin taught it beautifully in the Book of Mormon and others, and it is replete. It's pervasive in the Doctrine and Covenants, so the law of consecration is for us to understand our relationship to God and everything He's provided for us. Most saints do not realize the command in the doctrine. And this gets juicy, brothers and sisters. So you got to don't go away. Okay. If you're bored, get over it. It's going to get better. Okay. This is not boring stuff. This is good stuff. Okay. Because a lot of people do think we don't live the law of consecration. I don't live the law of concentration. All right. Whoa. So, da, 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 da. Section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants is to remember the poor and consecrate of thy properties for their support that which thou hast to impart unto them with a covenant indeed that can't be broken. So the command is to remember the poor and make the things that God has provided sacred to relieve poverty, to relieve suffering. The idea that God revealed the law of consecration. So that is a big part of the law of consecration right here. And a lot of people don't remember that or realize, and the saints are living that. We're living this law right now, and we're good at giving to the poor and helping those in need. The idea that God revealed the law of consecration to the early saints, but they couldn't do it, so he suspended or revoked or rescinded it, and someday in the future the saints will live it again. That idea does not import what? That idea does not important work for people. It does not important work for people. The work it does is what you referred to earlier. It excuses me now, right? Notice that it blames people in the past for the reason I'm not as obligated to live the law as I otherwise would be. Like someday we're going to have to give everything up, but right now we don't have to. And I'm not saying all saints say that, but some do. And it puts onto my children or grandchildren the obligation to measure up to it. So what it does is it lets me relax regarding the law of consecration. What is the law of consecration then? All right, and it gets good, brothers and sisters. Three-legged stool uses an analogy of a stool with three legs. You've got a three-legged stool. Of course, it doesn't work if you take any of the legs off the stool, right? No, it doesn't. First is agency. The Lord is clear that he has made us free to act for ourselves. He's given us a law to act upon and made us free to act for ourselves. This is one reason we maybe made up the rationale for why we didn't have to. Second, stewardship. Stewardship is what God has given me to act upon. And the revelations are clear about this. Joseph Smith's teachings are clear about this as well. So a stewardship is anything I can act upon as a free agent. Accountability, it's not a situation where we can do whatever we want and the consequences will be whatever we choose. The consequences will be what God has said they are, and he will hold us accountable. He's the owner of the universe and everything in it. Find in the revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants, for instance, section 51, that might not seem applicable today. Find the timeless principles, the tactics of acting out the law of consecration. Change. They have changed. They're changing, and we can expect that they will continue to do so. Ongoing revelation, right, brothers and sisters? Even on the principle of the law of consecration and tithing. And consecrating your times, talents, and gifts. It's not just monetary things. It's not just commodities. It's not livestock. It's not gold and silver. It's your time and your talents. It's giving somebody rides. It's going and helping the sick and the afflicted and giving to the poor. It's visiting the lonely and the elderly. It's helping somebody that's bedridden to change their clothing or whatever. He says, and you and I and everyone else can choose how we will act relative to those doctrines in the 21st century. I can't remember where I left off, but I will go to this because I had to get up for a second because I have allergies and I have to go with my nose. So, for example, the commandment is remember the poor and consecrate of thy property for their support. There's nothing that keeps me from doing that except my own agency. So we're told in the temple that we are to consecrate our time and our talents and all. We're living the law of consecration. But don't go away. Don't go away. If you think this is dry, it gets better. I promise. I'm not just saying that because I want you to watch the whole video. But I want you to watch the whole video. I can find ways to do that. The church has wonderful ways to do that. For instance, we covenant to remember the poor. For example, the commandment is remember the poor and consecrate of thy property for their support. There's nothing that keeps me from doing that except my own agency. We are pretty good at taking care of the poor, the hungry, the sick, and the afflicted. When we are relieving poverty, Are we not living the law of consecration? Yes, we are. Now, the good stuff. Do we have to give everything to the bishop's storehouse to be living the law of consecration? There is a perception that there was no private property under consecration, but there was. Section 42 in the revelation of the law itself. Stewards over their own property. The Lord says the law of consecration never did envision communal ownership of property. That undermines the doctrine of stewardship, private stewardship. So there have been instances, as you know, I lost my place. When Joseph got to see, look how they spelled. This is speech to text, brothers and sisters. Kirtland with a C. And it's not a U, right? I guess I didn't have to fix that. But Ohio, he found their saints who are trying to live the best they could, the early Christian order that they read about in the book of Acts. But they haven't received the revelation yet, okay? Or it hasn't been explained yet to them. They're trying to live like the early Christians in the book of Acts. And so they were struggling to figure out if they should have communal ownership and so forth. In response to that, the Lord gave section 42. See how my background just freezes every once in a while? I got to fix that. The doctrine comes and said, that's not what consecration is. Orderville, Utah. Is that right? Orderville? Or is that Orville? I don't live in Utah, so I don't know every place in Utah. Oh, Orderville is a place. Sorry. Well. Go Orderville. Cats. Bobcats, right? Or Orderville Roadrunners. I don't know. Okay. Where am I? Orderville, Utah was an attempt by saints to live a kind of communal order, but that didn't match what the revelations say. So there have been instances where saints or proto-letter saints have tried it in a kind of communal way, but that's not what the revelation of the law of consecration asks for or commands or directs. Private ownership is a powerful, dominant principle, and it can have the effect of undermining the law of consecration if we overemphasize private ownership as if it was an end in itself, okay? So, we're not saying that private ownership deviates us. It doesn't relieve us of living the law of consecration. And it's not a dominant principle and private ownership is a powerful dominant principle, and it can have the effect of undermining the law of consecration if we overemphasize private ownership as if it was an end in itself. J. Reuben Clark says the basic principle of the law of all the revelations in the United Order is that everything we have belongs to the Lord. Okay? Did the law of tithing replace the law of consecration? We are living the law of order. Section 119 is that tithing is what we would think of as part of consecration. And he explains the revelations. Tithing is one way to live the law of consecration. It's part of it, not instead of it. It's part of it. It's not instead of it. Now I know there are a couple of sentences in the heading of 119 that make it quite confusing, but the revelation itself was not understood. So you have the revelation, but it wasn't understood by the saints. That way, and it doesn't say that. The section heading to 119 says revelation given through Joseph, the prophet of Far West, Missouri, July 8th, 1838. In answer to his supplication, O Lord, show unto thy servants how much thy requires of the properties of thy people for a tithing. So that's really good. That's accurate information that comes right out of Joseph Smith's journal. On this day in 1838, the church is in a tough financial time. This is, as you know, right in the middle of an international economic collapse. The church is in debt quite a bit for the construction of the temple in Kirtland, Ohio, and now it's contemplating the building of a new temple in Far West, Missouri. And so we've got lots of challenges, how to pay for all of these things, how to build Zion. And the two bishops, Bishop Partridge and Bishop Whitney, have proposed to Joseph variations on tithing. Okay, so you've got these two bishops. There's people already trying to live some kind of communal law of giving of their substances and consecrating things, right? Giving a communal law to give. So here's these two bishops. They go to Joseph Smith and they're giving him ideas, right? So what does Joseph do? He prays about these. He goes to the Lord and he prays about these things. So we might assume that everybody knows what tithing is in 1838. Everybody knows it's a tenth. Well, they don't. Not like we know today. The revelations prior to this have not said anything about a tenth. Tithing has been used synonymously with any free will offering of any amount. So when we read the revelations, we got to get rid of our preconceived notions about what they mean and assumptions and figure out what they meant to them there then. So that's an important principle of that. So what I'm getting out of this is that there was no something else was going on that the Lord implemented. And then here came the lower law, the law of tithing. No. The law of tithing was a more sure, spelled out, it was bringing back. I look at it like Joseph Smith, when he was translating the Book of Mormon, he and Oliver came across baptism by immersion, and then they go to the Lord. Okay? The same thing I think possibly could have happened with tithing. That Joseph goes to the Lord, and then the Lord reveals to or brings something to his remembrance about the law of tithing in the Bible. Okay, so it does go back to the early church. Tithing has been used okay, so the revelations prior to this have not said anything about tenth. Tithing has been used synonymously with any free will offering of any amount. So when we read the revelations, we got to get rid of our preconceived notions about what they mean and assumptions and figure out what they meant to them there then. So that's an important principle of that. If you want to understand tithing, what it meant initially, you have to start with what was in the minds of Joseph Smith, Bishop Partridge, and Bishop Whitney. It gets better, folks. Keep watching. It's good stuff. So what's in their minds at this point is, let's get back to living the law of consecration by inviting the saints to tithe. And it's biblical. So we actually have a more sure way of consecrating, right? A more sure way of consecrating. Bishop Whitney was pretty simple. Bishop Whitney's ideas were pretty simple. Bishop Partridge's was a complicated financial formula based on his expertise. Joseph says, of course, always, let's ask the Lord, a prophet of God. So they seek and they receive this revelation, and notice that it says, thus saith the Lord, I require all their surplus property to be put into the hands of the bishop of my church in Zion. Okay? So here's where people get the idea of the law of consecration, right? I require all their surplus property to be put into the hands of the bishop of my church in Zion for building of my house, the laying of the foundation of Zion, for the priests of the depths of the presence of my church. This shall be the beginning of the tithing of my people. This is a restatement of the purposes of the law of consecration in section 42. It's not superseding it, it's restating it. It's not superseding it, it's restating it. And then notice verse 3. That's the beginning of the tithing. So you guys can go to section 42. Go to section 119, 42. Read those things. Listen to the podcast, the full podcast. I'm only giving you a very small portion of it, okay? The things that stood out to me, but I'm giving you the meat of it. But go listen to the podcast yourself. I'll leave the link. Well, actually, I leave it. There's not an actual link to the actual podcast, but I link you to byu.edu media and search. But it's right there. I'll give you the title. All three of them refer back to verse 1, the free will offering of all surplus property. It's a free will offering. After that, those who have thus been tithed, not tied, verse 4, 6, and 6 should pay 1/10 of all their interest annually. This should be a standing law to them forever. So not a temporary law to be replaced someday, not a lower law. But it says this should be a standing law to them forever. Interesting. Okay. Notice that the words lower and higher are those are their words. I don't know, the speech to text. Those are words we apply to the scriptures, but the scriptures don't use. The scriptures don't talk about lower laws and higher laws. They don't say tithing is a lower law and consecration of a higher law. They don't think that way, but we do. We've imposed that on it, and it's folklore. It's basically folklore on it, and we have to be careful that we don't make the scriptures mean something they don't mean or didn't ever say. So tithing is part of consecration. It's not instead of consecration. That's easy to understand because in the heading it says the Lord had previously given to the church the law of consecration and stewardship of property. That's true. That law is in section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants. But in that same sentence, it says which members, chiefly the leading elders, entered into by a covenant that was to be everlasting. Now, that part of the sentence tells us that the law of consecration that applies to all saints everywhere in section 42 is being conflated with a later covenant that the leaders of the church were to enter with regard to their management of church assets and properties. That covenant, as you know, is foreshadowed in section 78. It's stated in section 82, and then it's nullified in section 104. That's the covenant that the leading elders entered. And it really has nothing to do, well, it certainly has, this is him talking. A lot of this is him talking. It certainly has to do with the law of consecration. When saints live the law of consecration, you've got to have church policies, programs, personal in place to manage. And that's what's being talked about in the second half of the sentence. He says, sorry to be so complicated, but in other words, the sentence is confusing two different covenants. One is the covenant all Latter-day Saints are obligated to keep to live the law of consecration. The other one is the covenant that only between 9 and 12 Latter-day Saint leaders ever were part of the united order or united firm to manage the church under the law of consecration. Okay? So, the covenant that only 9 and 12 Latter-day Saint leaders ever were part of the united order or the united firm to live the law of consecration. And then it says, because of failure on the part of many, and this is confusing, he says, I don't know what the word many refers to many church members who are under covenant to live the law of consecration in section 42, or many of the church leaders under covenant. The covenant of section 82 to live according to a united order or a management firm because of the failure on the part of many to abide this covenant. The Lord withdrew it for a time. That makes me think that this sentence is referring to section 104, which nullifies the covenant of section 82 that essentially a dozen church leaders had entered. And remember, this is Stephen Harper's ideas of what the law of consecration might mean. But I think he makes a good case. I really do. He says, well, I'm not trying to blame anybody or cause further confusion, but what I'm just saying there is that the revelation itself is not that confusing. It's pretty simple and straightforward, and it simply says tithing is now part of consecration. But a confusing and pretty complicated history can leave us under the impression that the Lord took the law of consecration away and he'll restore it again someday, but that's not what the scriptures say. And I think it misses the point too that tithing is primarily financial. Consecration is holistic. It's not about your money. It's about yourself, your time, the gifts that you'll be given, and everything that you can give. And what does holistic mean? Holistic means your whole mind, spirit, body, who you are. It's our soul. We consecrate who we are. Our time, our talents, and everything else, temporal things, to the building up of the kingdom of God, and to the establishment of Zion. And how do we establish Zion? And how do we build up the kingdom of God? We take care of the poor. It's not just we take care of all people around us. We consecrate our time and talents to not just to the saints, but to the world, to our neighbor, our fellow man, who is my neighbor, right? Receiving help from the bishop's storehouse is also living the law of consecration. So when you receive help, you are living the higher law.